You wrote this book called The Kill Chain, so you've thought a lot about kind of the future of warfare. And I just wanted to start by getting your assessment of sort of how things have shifted in recent years, where we're headed toward. I think a lot of us paying attention to what's been happening in Ukraine, particularly just in the way that war has been fought. But what does this threat landscape look like to you?
Yeah, I think it's changed remarkably over the past 5 to 10 years. I mean, when I was back in government in the Senate Armed Services Committee, kind of thinking about all the things that eventually went into that book, right? I mean, you had to convince people that China was a pacing threat. You had to convince them that kind of new defense technology was going to be really important. Things like drones and artificial intelligence, and you got a lot of eye rolls, from people who more or less thought this stuff was science fiction. And I think you fast forward now to 2026. I think the threat landscape is completely upside down. I think you have seen obviously in the war in Ukraine, but then in a lot of other theaters around the world, that this technology is absolutely here, right? The future of warfare is not something that's going to happen to us in a decade and we have time to get ready. It's very much unfolding now. A lot of these, robotic systems, drones, autonomous systems, different kinds of weapons, this is all here, right? And it's only getting better, it's only getting faster, and it's proliferating everywhere. So again, when you look at something like Operation Epic Fury, you see an environment that is far less permissive for the United States to operate in terms of flying aircraft. It's been publicly reported we've lost a lot of remotely piloted aircraft and other things. The ability to obviously kind of transit the Strait of Hormuz when it's coming under threat from, one-way attack drones and sort of, weaponized robotic boats and other things. This, I think, is just a harbinger of many, many, many things to come. And it's a very different landscape than what we were seeing 10 years ago. And I think the big so what for the United States is, how are we going to continue to be militarily advantageous and relevant in a future where this technology is getting better faster and it's proliferating everywhere.
Situate Anduril in that conversation. So we'd had these legacy weapons providers for a very long time. You're now competing with them. You talked about kind of the difficulty of conveying to people 10 years ago where things were headed.
Yeah.
Are we at a point now where policymakers in Washington around the world get it? This is sort of where things are going.
I think they do. And I think that, the question has always been, when we go from kind of getting it and internalizing the lessons to actually driving that into different behavior. And I think that that's starting to happen, right? So I think that, I give the current administration a lot of credit for really starting to do the things that a lot of people for a lot of time had been talking about, but not really doing kind of at scale. So as an example, we at Anduril are working a collaboration with the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army. And again, this is all very much driven through the administration's leadership to mass produce low-cost cruise missiles. So, systems that are quite capable, very long range, but also much cheaper, much simpler, easier to build than kind of our legacy weapon systems. So the whole idea of being able to build much larger quantities of systems at a much lower price point to be able to kind of get those inventories larger to deal with these kinds of potential protracted conflicts. Like, I think it's an example, and there's a lot of others, of how this is starting to change. But the real question is not, can we go to conferences like this and say things that reflect the fact that we think things are different, but are we actually changing our behavior? Are we putting our money, whether it's as industry or as the government, actually where our mouth is in terms of, getting it increasingly into those kind of new areas of capability that are going to be so important now and into the future?
So when we talk about the Barracuda 500, as you talk about, it's a leaner supply chain, things move faster.
Yeah.
How are you able to do that? So we look at kind of the hindrances of the past.
Yeah.
What is Anduril able to do now that makes it easier to produce things at scale and much faster?
Yeah, a lot of this is not trickery and, kind of highfalutin technology, right? I mean, I think it really comes back to starting from the beginning and from the premise that, you have to design weapons and other defense systems that are far simpler, that are easier, faster, and cheaper to build, and can be built by a much larger workforce than our traditional weapon systems, where the people who can contribute from a workforce perspective are often very highly skilled. They take years to get into a position of really being able to contribute on the manufacturing side. So we kind of come in it from a very different perspective, which is, if at the end result I want to have a system that is, mass producible by the largest number of people on the fastest timeline for the lowest price in the largest volume, you would make radically different choices at the design phase, and that's what we've done. So designing out a lot of the complexity and a lot of the critical materials and a lot of the things that make weapons, traditional weapons, so much more exquisite, so much more expensive, so much harder to build and build at scale and build at speed. So that's really, I think, at the essence what the Barracuda is. It's actually a relatively simple system, and it's designed that way on purpose. And then sort of how you go about making that system more intelligent, more capable, I would say that's where the real kind of special sauce comes in from a software perspective, the advanced autonomy, where you can now have systems collaborating together in a way that you really aren't able to do with traditional weapons because you're firing them sort of one at a time. So it's this combination of like very advanced software, but then very simplified design and design for mass production.
So we've talked about kind of U.S. demand for this. I know they're going to be produced in Poland as well.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about Europe's demand for weapons at this moment in time, so drawing upon your past experience in the Senate and policy and also just your current experience now. How do you stand to kind of help Europe with that as you look at kind of the eastern flank of NATO?
Yeah, so it's a complicated picture in Europe. I think the good news is that European countries have gotten the message. I give the Trump administration a fair amount of credit, but not all the credit. I think the Europeans deserve a lot of credit too, in terms of really starting to meaningfully increase their defense budgets, and that's happening across the NATO alliance. There still are laggards, but for the most part, this is going in the right direction. So that's the good news. I think the challenge for American companies is with that increase in European defense spending, a lot of those European countries want that money to go to their own companies and to build up their own production capacity. And that makes a ton of sense. I think they've been very frustrated with the year-long delays that they're seeing in kind of the U.S. foreign military sales process of buying weapons that are then exported to from the U.S. to Europe. So they want to be able to build up their own capacity to rearm themselves. And I think there's obviously a European jobs component to that too, which is important. So I think for our perspective at Anduril, right, we can't sort of show up in the traditional way and say, we're here to export you things that were made in America. So I think the way we're going about it, and the Poland example that you offered is a good one, is really building with Europe, in Europe, for Europe. So the ability to team with PGZ, the state-owned armaments company in Poland, to take that Barracuda system that we've designed and actually have it built in Poland by PGZ with Polish engineers and Polish manufacturing technicians and workers, and then be able to scale that and provide that out of Poland to other NATO allies. And I think that's really just the beginning. I mean, I think you'll also see us increasingly looking also to incorporate or kind of collaborate with different kinds of companies across Europe, whether those are commercial production companies, traditional defense companies, kind of new entrants, kind of new European defense companies, and then possibly actually look to land Anduril in Europe as a European company with European leadership and workforce and production capacity with a significant investment of us going into Europe. I think we're open to all of this. And, as I think it was said here earlier today, different European countries are going to have different demands and different desires and needs. And, we're just trying to meet different countries where they're at and really give them the benefit of what they want from the United States, which is access to technology and know-how and capital, without having to go through, kind of the traditional process, kind of intermediated by the U.S. government of buying these things exported from the U.S., with all of the, kind of attendant delays and frustrations that come with that.
I want to ask you lastly about weapons scarcity, and it's something a lot of folks are talking about since the start of the war in Iran. And when that conversation comes up, invariably there are people who say, we're not going to be as well equipped if something happens in Asia.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about that? You've sounded the alarm about the prospects of there being war with Taiwan for a long time.
Yeah.
How worried should we be about preparedness, and how worried are you about the prospects of there being conflict in that part of the world?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the good news is that the weapons sector in the United States has never been more, kind of energized, whether that's traditional weapons makers, kind of new weapons producers like us and others. There's a huge amount of government focus and sort of resource going into this. Again, give the leadership of the Pentagon a lot of credit for actually getting into the nuts and bolts of why we've had a lot of these problems in terms of funding challenges, lack of multi-year demand signal, and I think a lot of that's starting to get fixed, and we're a beneficiary of that, right? I mean, we're signing multi-year framework agreements with the United States Army, with the United States Air Force for this, Barracuda 500 low-cost cruise missile program. I think the challenge is going to be now we need to get building, and that takes time. I think it's impossible to look at something like Epic Fury and not be sort of a bit struck by the fact that, again, according to public reports, we've kind of gone through something like a decade's worth of Tomahawk production and a few months of that conflict. Those systems take years to build back. So if we're using them there, they're not available elsewhere. So that's just a reality that we're going to have to contend with. But I kind of go back to where I started. I think the good news now is that everybody, in government, industry, old, new, American, European, everybody is focused on this question of munitions scarcity, kind of weapons inventory, need for weapons production. I think there's a huge opportunity to really get this problem right, which has been a problem that I think many of us have known has existed for a very long time, and we're now actually seeing that come to light in these, kind of current examples. Those realities are what they are. We can't wish them away. They are there. I think the only thing that we can do, which is now starting to happen, is we just need to build a different kind of weapons inventory, where the challenge is not, how do we build back what we had? It's how do we build back 10x what we had or 20x what we had? Because that's what I think we're going to need to be ready for, not just one conflict, but potentially multiple simultaneously. And to be able to do this as a function of time, where that war is not going to be over in days and weeks. It's going to, regrettably, I fear, stretch on into months and years. And that to me is one of the key lessons of Iran and Ukraine and a lot of these current conflicts. And that's, I think, what we're going to have to be ready for in the United States, which is this reality of protracted conflict coming back to us.